Get this homeless man out of my lobby.
I only asked to stay until the rain stops.
Mr. Whitmore, he isn't hurting anyone.
He doesn't belong in a place like this.
Here's get this black homeless man out of my lobby. He smells like trouble. Bradley Whitmore stabbed a finger toward the entrance, then impatiently waved 2 security guards forward as if Malcolm Hayes weren't even human. Conversations stopped. Every eye in the marble lobby turned toward the elderly black man standing quietly beneath the chandelier, rainwater dripping from his worn coat. Malcolm lowered his head slightly. "I'm only asking for a few minutes until the storm passes." Bradley let out a mocking laugh. "A few minutes, you'll scare away guests who've spent thousands to be here." He stepped closer, kicked Malcolm's faded backpack across the polished floor, sending an old notebook, a family photograph, and a silver pocket watch sliding in every direction. Then he sneered even louder. "Look at yourself. You don't belong in a 5-star hotel. You belong out on the sidewalk." As Malcolm knelt to gather his belongings, Bradley folded his arms and delivered one final insult. "You're trash. And trash doesn't get a welcome here." Several guests gasped. Others silently raised their phones, capturing every humiliating second. Malcolm carefully picked up the worn pocket watch, his trembling hands revealing neither anger nor fear. At that exact moment, a black luxury sedan rolled to the front entrance. The owner of the Grand Meridian stepped out, spotted Malcolm from across the lobby, and froze. Seconds later, he walked straight toward the homeless man and raised his hand in a solemn salute. Before you discover why one of Chicago's most powerful hotel owners saluted the very man everyone else humiliated, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. If you believe a person's worth can never be measured by their appearance, subscribe and stay with us, because this story is only beginning. Hey y'all, an old woman once told me the road remembers everyone who walks it kindly. I've tried to walk kindly ever since. Only 4 hours earlier, Chicago had looked nothing like the storm now beating against the windows of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The morning sky had been bright, but Malcolm Hayes knew better than to trust an October forecast. At 68, life had taught him that storms often arrived without warning. Some came from the clouds. Others came from people. Malcolm adjusted the straps of his faded backpack as he walked along Michigan Avenue. The backpack held nearly everything he still owned: a change of clothes, a weathered notebook, a family photograph sealed inside a plastic sleeve, and an old silver pocket watch wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. He never let that watch out of his sight. Most people assumed he carried it because it was valuable. The truth was far more personal. It reminded him of a promise that had survived even after everything else in his life had disappeared. As office workers hurried past with coffee cups in hand, Malcolm greeted each person with the same gentle smile. "Good morning." Most ignored him. Some avoided eye contact. A few quietly returned the greeting before rushing away. He never seemed offended. After years of living on the streets, he had learned that indifference often hurt less than cruelty. By late afternoon, dark clouds swallowed the Chicago skyline. The first raindrops fell just as Malcolm finished helping an elderly woman retrieve groceries that had rolled into the street after her shopping cart tipped over. "You should keep this," the woman said, offering him $20 with trembling hands. Malcolm smiled warmly and shook his head. "You need it more than I do, ma'am." The woman stared at him in disbelief. "But where will you sleep tonight?" "I'll find somewhere dry." She wanted to say something else, but Malcolm had already continued down the sidewalk. Rain quickly turned into a downpour. Within minutes, sidewalks emptied. People disappeared into restaurants, office buildings, and subway entrances. Malcolm pulled his thin coat tighter around himself, but it offered little protection. Cold rain soaked through the fabric until every step became heavier than the last. Across the street, bright golden lights illuminated one of Chicago's most luxurious landmarks. the Grand Meridian Hotel. Its towering glass entrance reflected polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and elegantly dressed guests arriving for the biggest business event of the year. Luxury vehicles lined the curb one after another. Valets hurried between expensive sedans and exotic sports cars. Inside, executives from around the country were gathering for Harrington Hospitality Group's annual investment gala, where a partnership worth nearly $400 million would be announced the following morning. Every employee had been warned. Nothing could go wrong, especially not tonight. Inside the lobby, Bradley Whitmore adjusted his tie for what felt like the 10th time. He wasn't nervous. He was obsessed. Everything had to appear flawless. Every flower arrangement stood exactly where he wanted. Every chandelier sparkled. Every employee's uniform had been inspected twice. He believed perfection wasn't a standard. It was power. Bradley stopped beside the reception desk. Claire. The young receptionist looked up immediately. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. If anyone who doesn't belong here walks through those doors, remove them immediately. Claire hesitated. What do you mean by doesn't belong? Bradley answered without lowering his voice. I don't care if it's a panhandler, a drunk, or someone looking like they slept under a bridge. Several nearby employees fell silent. We have investors arriving all evening. I won't let one homeless person ruin the image of this hotel. Claire shifted uncomfortably. What if they only need help? Bradley's expression hardened. This is a luxury hotel. He leaned closer. We sell exclusivity, not charity. Claire forced herself to nod, but something about those words settled heavily in her chest. She had grown up watching her single mother work double shifts just to keep food on the table. She knew how quickly life could change. Outside, Malcolm stopped beneath a nearby awning. Rainwater poured from the edge of the roof like a waterfall. He watched people laugh together inside cafes while thunder rolled overhead. His shoes were completely soaked. His hands had begun to shake from the cold. Across the street, the revolving doors of the Grand Meridian continued spinning as guests entered one after another. Malcolm didn't want food. He didn't want money. He didn't even want to step fully inside. He simply hoped to stand somewhere dry for a few minutes until the worst of the storm passed. He quietly crossed the street. The doorman glanced at Malcolm's soaked clothing before opening the door for another guest. For a brief moment, Malcolm waited politely until everyone had entered. Then he stepped into the warm lobby. Heat instantly replaced the freezing wind outside. The scent of fresh flowers and polished wood filled the air. Water dripped quietly from Malcolm's coat onto the marble floor. Several guests turned their heads. Conversations slowed. Eyes lingered. Some whispered behind raised glasses of champagne. Claire noticed him first. She could see exhaustion in his face, but no sign of aggression. Only dignity. Only fatigue. She started to walk toward him with a welcoming smile. Before she could speak, another voice echoed through the lobby. Sir. Bradley Whitmore had already seen him. His polished shoes clicked sharply across the marble floor. Every employee instinctively stepped aside. The room suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. Malcolm turned politely. I'm sorry, he said softly. I was hoping I could stand inside until the rain eases. Bradley didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly looked Malcolm up and down, taking in the soaked coat, worn boots, and faded backpack. The corners of his mouth curled into a look of unmistakable disgust. Guests nearby fell silent, sensing that something unpleasant was about to unfold. And Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, afraid she already knew exactly how her manager was going to respond. Bradley Whitmore folded his arms, his polished shoes stopping only a few feet from Malcolm Hayes. The elegant conversations that had filled the Grand Meridian lobby faded into an uneasy silence. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, but every eye had shifted toward the soaked elderly man standing alone on the marble floor. Bradley forced a thin smile that carried no warmth. "I'm going to ask you one time," he said. "Leave." Malcolm met his eyes without hostility. "I understand this is private property. I only hope to stay out of the rain for a few minutes. As soon as it slows down, I'll be on my way." Bradley gave a dry laugh. "You've already stayed too long." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly couple quietly stepped farther away, while a young businessman frowned as if he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. Claire Bennett finally gathered enough courage to approach. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said carefully. "He isn't bothering anyone." Bradley turned sharply. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." Claire immediately lowered her eyes. Malcolm noticed her embarrassment. "It's all right," he said gently. "She's only trying to be kind." Bradley's expression darkened even further. "Kindness doesn't pay this hotel's bills." He stepped closer until he was almost face to face with Malcolm. "You know what happens when wealthy guests walk into a lobby and see an elderly black homeless man standing here?" Malcolm remained silent. "They question our standards." The words echoed through the lobby. Claire looked down in disbelief. Several employees stiffened where they stood. Even some guests looked visibly disturbed by what they had just heard. Malcolm spoke quietly. "My appearance may make people uncomfortable." He paused before continuing, "But respect costs nothing." For a brief second, Bradley's smile disappeared. Instead of calming him, Malcolm's dignity seemed to irritate him even more. "Oh, don't lecture me." Bradley snapped his fingers. "Derek." The head of security hurried over. "Yes, sir." "Escort him outside." Derek hesitated after looking at Malcolm. "Sir, he isn't causing any disturbance." Bradley's voice became colder. "Are you refusing my order?" "No, sir." Derek sighed almost invisibly before nodding toward Malcolm. "I'm sorry." Malcolm gave a small, understanding smile. "I know you're only doing your job." As Derek reached for Malcolm's arm, another security officer, Ethan Pierce, arrived from the opposite side. Without waiting, Ethan grabbed Malcolm roughly by the shoulder. "Let's go." The sudden force caught Malcolm off balance. His worn backpack slipped from his shoulder and crashed against the polished marble. The zipper burst open. Everything inside spilled across the lobby. A faded notebook slid beneath a leather sofa. Several neatly folded letters scattered across the floor. A weathered family photograph drifted face down into a puddle of rainwater. Finally, the old silver pocket watch rolled away, spinning in slow circles before coming to rest beneath the hotel's enormous crystal chandelier. The soft, metallic sound echoed through the silent lobby. Malcolm instinctively bent down. "Please." Before he could reach it, Bradley casually stepped forward. His polished shoe stopped only inches from the watch. He stared at it with open contempt. "So that's your treasure." He nudged it with the tip of his shoe. "It probably isn't worth enough to buy a cup of coffee." A few guests looked away. Others continued recording with their phones. Malcolm's eyes remained fixed on the pocket watch. His voice trembled for the first time. "Please don't touch it." Bradley ignored him. Instead, he slowly kicked the watch several feet across the marble floor. It struck the base of a decorative column with a sharp, metallic crack. Claire gasped. "Oh my God!" Malcolm hurried toward it, dropping to one knee despite the pain in his aging joints. He carefully lifted the watch into both hands. His fingers gently brushed away invisible dust before opening the cover. For a brief moment, relief crossed his face. The watch still worked. Its quiet ticking continued beneath the noise of the storm outside. Bradley laughed. "You care more about that piece of junk than yourself." Malcolm looked up calmly. "It isn't junk." Bradley leaned down until only a few inches separated them. "Neither is that backpack, I suppose." Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed the faded photograph lying nearby. He glanced at it for less than a second before holding it up for several guests to see. "Look," his mocking voice echoed across the lobby. "Even his memories are falling apart." Malcolm immediately reached toward him. "Please, give it back." Bradley pulled it away. "You expect sympathy because life didn't work out." He tossed the photograph onto the wet marble. It landed face up. Claire caught a glimpse before Malcolm picked it up. She saw a smiling woman, a little girl, and a much younger Malcolm standing together beneath bright summer sunshine. Something tightened inside her chest. Without thinking, she walked behind the reception desk, grabbed a clean hotel towel and a bottle of water, then quietly approached Malcolm. "Sir." She knelt beside him. "Here, please dry your hands." Malcolm looked surprised. "You don't have to do this." "I know." She smiled gently. "But I want to." The entire lobby watched. Bradley's face turned bright red. "Claire." She froze. "Stand up." She slowly rose to her feet. Bradley's voice thundered across the marble hall. "Did I hire you to serve hotel guests?" He pointed directly at Malcolm. "Or to wait on homeless people?" Every employee stood perfectly still. No one dared breathe. Claire swallowed hard, but refused to step away from Malcolm. "I was only trying to help someone who was cold." Bradley took one deliberate step closer. "You just embarrassed this hotel in front of every important guest we have." Claire's hands tightened around the unused towel. Around them, more phones were quietly recording. One businessman subtly turned his camera sideways, making sure Bradley's face remained perfectly visible in the frame. Outside, thunder shook the building once again. Inside, another storm was only beginning. Thunder rolled across downtown Chicago as the tension inside the Grand Meridian Hotel became almost unbearable. Bradley Whitmore glared at Claire Bennett as though she had committed an unforgivable offense. "You have exactly 5 seconds to put that towel down and get back behind the front desk." Claire's fingers tightened around the neatly folded white towel. She looked at Malcolm Hayes, whose soaked coat still dripped onto the polished marble floor. His silver pocket watch rested safely in one hand, while the damp family photograph remained carefully protected inside the pages of his worn notebook. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," Claire said quietly, "but he's freezing." Bradley's jaw clenched. 4. The lobby fell silent. 3. Every employee stared at the floor. 2. Claire didn't move. Bradley's face darkened. "Congratulations," he gave a slow, sarcastic clap. "You've just shown every investor in this building that my own employees value charity over professionalism." Claire swallowed hard, but refused to lower her eyes. "I believe professionalism includes treating people with dignity." Several guests exchanged surprised looks. One elderly businessman whispered to his wife. "She's right." His wife nodded. "This has gone too far." Bradley ignored them. Instead, he turned toward the security team. "Derek." "Yes, sir." "Escort Mr. Hayes completely off hotel property." Derek hesitated. "Sir, it's still pouring outside." "I don't care." "But he'll be standing in the storm." Bradley stepped closer until Derek could feel his breath. "If I have to repeat myself again, you'll be cleaning out your locker before sunrise." Derek lowered his head. Understood. Malcolm slowly stood before either guard could touch him. There won't be any trouble. His calm voice somehow made the entire situation feel even heavier. He looked at Claire. Thank you. She shook her head, tears beginning to form. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. Malcolm smiled gently. You reminded me there are still good people in this world. The words left Claire speechless. As Malcolm picked up his backpack, Ethan shoved it into his chest with unnecessary force. Keep moving. Malcolm stumbled backward but managed to keep his balance. No anger crossed his face, only quiet exhaustion. The revolving doors opened. Cold wind rushed inside, carrying sheets of rain across the marble entrance. Guests instinctively stepped backward to avoid getting wet. Derek quietly held one side of the door open. I'm sorry, he whispered so only Malcolm could hear. I know. Malcolm gave him one final nod before stepping into the storm. The heavy rain swallowed him almost instantly. Claire watched through the glass as Malcolm slowly walked toward a bus stop across the street. He sat alone on the wet bench, without even attempting to shield himself from the rain. Back inside, Bradley straightened his jacket as though nothing had happened. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced confidently, I apologize for the brief inconvenience. A few guests resumed their conversations. Others didn't. One man quietly stopped recording and immediately began typing on his phone. Another uploaded the video before Bradley had even finished speaking. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media. Luxury hotel manager calls elderly homeless man trash. Did anyone else hear what he said? This is disgusting. Across the lobby, investigative journalist Marcus Ellison leaned against a marble column reviewing the footage on his phone. He had originally come to cover Harrington Hospitality's investment gala. Now he wasn't interested in the business announcement anymore. Something about Malcolm's composure refused to leave his mind. Most people reacted with anger when humiliated. Malcolm had reacted with grace. Marcus replayed the recording again, then again. His eyes narrowed. There was something strangely familiar about the old silver pocket watch Malcolm had protected so desperately. He couldn't explain why. He simply couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen it somewhere before. Meanwhile, Bradley walked briskly into the hotel's security office. Rows of surveillance monitors displayed every hallway, elevator entrance, and ballroom inside the Grand Meridian. A young surveillance technician looked up. Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. Bradley closed the office door behind him. I need today's lobby footage. The technician clicked a few keys. No problem, sir. Bradley lowered his voice. Delete everything recorded between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. The technician froze. I'm sorry. You heard me. The young man stared at him in disbelief. Company policy requires written authorization before deleting surveillance footage. Bradley's patience disappeared. I am the authorization. The technician shifted nervously. Sir, the footage automatically backs up to the central Harrington server every 30 minutes. Bradley's eyes narrowed. What did you say? It may already have been uploaded. Silence filled the room. Bradley slowly turned toward the wall of monitors. His reflection stared back at him through dozens of glowing screens. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Just then, his phone vibrated. The caller ID read Charles Harrington. Bradley immediately answered. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. A calm voice came through the speaker. Bradley. Yes, sir. My meeting ended earlier than expected. Bradley's face brightened. Wonderful. We'll be ready for your arrival tomorrow morning. There was a brief pause. I'm afraid you've misunderstood. Bradley's smile faded. I'm already on my way. Another pause. I'll be there in less than 20 minutes. The call ended. Bradley lowered the phone slowly. His heartbeat quickened. Charles Harrington almost never changed his schedule without notice. Outside, the rain continued to pour. Across the street, Malcolm remained seated quietly at the bus stop, completely unaware that the owner of the hotel was now driving toward the Grand Meridian. Inside the security office, Bradley stared at the surveillance monitors one last time. Somewhere deep inside, an unfamiliar feeling began to grow. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. Bradley Whitmore remained motionless inside the security office long after Charles Harrington ended the call. Less than 20 minutes. That was all the time he had. He looked at the surveillance technician. Tell me exactly when the lobby footage was backed up. The young technician checked the system again. The automatic upload completed at 6:58 p.m., sir. Bradley's stomach tightened. So the central server has a copy? Yes, sir. Bradley forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fine. He walked out without another word, but his mind raced through every possible solution. If Charles somehow saw that video before arriving, everything could change. Across the lobby, Claire Bennett quietly wiped tears from her face before returning to the reception desk. She tried to greet arriving guests with the same professional smile she always wore, but it no longer felt genuine. Every time the revolving door opened, she found herself looking outside toward the bus stop across the street. Malcolm was still there. Rain poured over the shelter, and icy wind swept through the empty street. He remained seated with his backpack resting beside him, occasionally looking down at the old pocket watch in his hands. Claire whispered to herself, I can't just leave him out there. She opened a cabinet beneath the reception counter and removed a neatly wrapped sandwich, a bottle of water, and a thick hotel blanket normally reserved for guests stranded during severe weather. Just as she stepped away from the desk, Claire, Bradley's voice stopped her cold. She slowly turned. What are you carrying? She hesitated. Emergency supplies. For whom? She didn't answer. Bradley already knew. His lips curled into another mocking smile. Let me save you the trouble. He walked over, took the blanket from her hands, and tossed it back behind the counter. The hotel doesn't provide charity services. Claire couldn't hide the disappointment on her face. He's an elderly man. Bradley shrugged. Then perhaps he should have planned his life better. Several nearby employees heard every word. None dared respond, but each one silently remembered it. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Marcus Ellison sat alone in the hotel cafe, replaying his recording for what must have been the 10th time. Something about Malcolm's reaction bothered him. Most people humiliated that publicly either shouted, cried, or fought back. Malcolm had done none of those things. Instead, he had protected the old silver pocket watch before protecting himself. Marcus zoomed into the video frame. The watch. The engraving looked strangely familiar. He paused the video just as Malcolm opened it, after Bradley kicked it across the marble floor. There, for only a fraction of a second, a small crest was visible inside the cover. Marcus leaned closer. No. He immediately opened his laptop and searched through archived photographs from years of reporting on Chicago's business elite. Nearly 15 minutes passed. Then suddenly he found it. A photograph taken 30 years earlier at the grand opening of the original Grand Meridian Hotel. Standing beside founder Edward Harrington was a younger black man. His face was partially hidden beneath a construction helmet, But hanging from his vest pocket was the exact same silver watch. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. It can't be. He enlarged the image. The resemblance was unmistakable. The older man's eyes, the same calm expression, the same watch. Marcus immediately saved the photograph. Something far bigger than a discrimination story had just landed in his lap. At nearly the same moment, Claire walked into the hotel's records department. The storage room smelled of old paper and polished wood. Towering shelves held decades of employee files, architectural plans, newspaper clippings, and photographs documenting the hotel's history. Linda Foster, the archive manager, looked up from her desk. "Claire, what brings you down here?" Claire hesitated. "This may sound strange. I'm looking for old photographs from the hotel's opening years." Linda smiled. "History project." "Not exactly." She explained everything that had happened in the lobby. Linda's expression slowly changed. "He called an elderly man trash." Claire nodded. "And I think I've seen that man before." Linda frowned thoughtfully. "Help me." The two women began opening archive boxes one after another. Employee banquets, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity galas, construction photographs. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Then Claire stopped. "Wait." She carefully lifted a large framed photograph wrapped in protective paper. It showed the hotel's grand opening decades earlier. Edward Harrington stood proudly in the center. Executives surrounded him. Construction supervisors smiled nearby. Almost everyone wore formal suits, except one man, standing just behind Edward, covered in dust from construction work, was a tall black worker smiling modestly toward the camera. Claire's eyes widened. "It's him." Linda stepped closer. My goodness. The face was younger, the hair darker, but there was no doubt. It was Malcolm Hayes. Claire looked again. Edward Harrington wasn't simply standing beside him. One hand rested firmly on Malcolm's shoulder, like family. Neither woman noticed that someone had quietly entered the storage room. Bradley Whitmore. He had followed Claire after watching the security cameras. "What are you doing?" Claire turned sharply. Bradley walked straight toward the photograph. For the first time that evening, his confident expression faltered. He stared silently at Malcolm's younger face, then at Edward Harrington, then back again. "What file did this come from?" Linda answered honestly. "The historical archives." Bradley's voice became unusually calm. "I'll take it." Claire instinctively stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, but archive materials can't leave this room without authorization." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my authority?" "No." "Then hand it over." Linda looked uncertain. "Company policy requires Mr. Harrington's approval for original historical records." Those words landed harder than anyone expected. Bradley's jaw tightened. Without another word, he took out his phone and checked the time. Charles Harrington was now less than 10 minutes away. For the first time in years. Bradley realized he no longer controlled the story. Across the street, Malcolm quietly closed the silver pocket watch and looked toward the glowing hotel entrance one more time. He had no idea that inside the archives of the very building he had just been thrown out of, a single forgotten photograph had begun unraveling every lie Bradley Whitmore hoped to keep buried. The archive room fell into complete silence. Bradley Whitmore's eyes remained fixed on the old photograph in Claire Bennett's hands. The smiling black construction worker standing beside Edward Harrington looked painfully familiar. Too familiar. Bradley forced himself to look away. "It doesn't prove anything," he muttered. Claire studied the photograph again. "Then why is Mr. Harrington standing with his hand on Malcolm's shoulder?" Bradley answered without hesitation. "My father took hundreds of publicity photos during construction. Workers appeared in plenty of them." Linda Foster slowly shook her head. "No." Bradley turned sharply. "What do you mean, no?" Linda carefully removed another folder from the archive box. "I've worked in these archives for 26 years. She laid several photographs across the table. Now, in every official opening photograph, Edward Harrington stood beside city officials, investors, architects, or family members. She pointed toward Malcolm. "I've never seen him stand this close to an ordinary laborer." Claire leaned over the table. Edward Harrington wasn't simply smiling. His expression carried unmistakable gratitude, almost affection. Bradley immediately gathered the photographs into a stack. "That's enough." Claire reached out. "Mr. Whitmore." "I said enough." His voice echoed through the room. Neither woman spoke again. Bradley hurried out, carrying nothing but his mind was racing faster than ever. If Charles Harrington recognized Malcolm, everything would collapse. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. The rain softened into a steady drizzle as Malcolm remained seated beneath the bus shelter. His clothes were still soaked, but he seemed unconcerned. He opened the silver pocket watch once more. The tiny hands continued moving with perfect precision. Inside the cover rested a small inscription. "Time never forgets those who choose courage." Malcolm gently traced the engraved words with his thumb. A faint smile crossed his face. "So you kept your promise, Edward." The quiet words disappeared into the evening air. Several miles away, a black executive sedan moved steadily through downtown Chicago. Charles Harrington sat alone in the rear seat. Unlike many billionaire executives, he wasn't reading financial reports. Instead, he stared through the rain-covered window in thoughtful silence. His assistant, Megan Shaw, broke the quiet. "Sir, the investment partners have already arrived." "I know. They're asking whether tonight's private reception will begin on schedule." Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the old leather folder resting beside him. Inside were several handwritten documents that had belonged to his late father. He opened the folder carefully. The first page carried Edward Harrington's unmistakable handwriting. "Never judge a person's worth by the clothes they wear. The greatest man I ever met owned almost nothing." Charles had read those words countless times. Even after 30 years, they still felt personal. Megan noticed the familiar page. "You still carry those letters?" Charles smiled faintly. "My father wanted me to." "Oh," she hesitated before asking quietly, "Did he ever tell you who he was writing about?" Charles looked out the window again. "Only once. And he told me that if I ever met that man again." Charles paused. "I was to thank him before I did anything else." Megan had heard that story before, but one question had never been answered. "Did your father ever tell you his name?" Charles slowly closed the folder. "Yes." His voice became almost a whisper. "Malcolm Hayes." Back at the Grand Meridian, Marcus Ellison continued digging through digital newspaper archives. The more he searched, the stranger everything became. Dozens of articles celebrated Edward Harrington's remarkable rise from struggling entrepreneur to hotel magnate. But scattered among those reports were several unexplained gaps: a warehouse fire, construction delays, insurance disputes. Then, one article caught Marcus's attention. Local builder survives massive warehouse blaze. The article was brief. Edward Harrington had narrowly escaped a fire that destroyed one of his earliest storage facilities. No further details. No mention of how he survived. Marcus frowned. There has to be more. He searched again. Nothing. Almost as if part of the story had disappeared. Meanwhile, Bradley stormed into his office. He slammed the door so hard the glass walls shook. His phone immediately rang. It was Gregory Miles, one of the investors. "Bradley, we've been hearing rumors online." "What rumors?" "A video." Bradley's pulse quickened. "What video?" "The one showing your security team throwing an elderly homeless man into the rain." Bradley forced a laugh. "It's being taken completely out of context." Gregory didn't sound convinced. "I hope so. The Harrington family takes reputation very seriously." The line went dead. Bradley immediately opened social media, his face drained of color. The video had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Comments flooded the screen. "Who treats an old man like that? Fire this manager. That homeless gentleman handled himself with more class than anyone inside that hotel. Boycott Grand Meridian until they apologize." Bradley slammed the phone onto his desk. No. For the first time in years, public opinion wasn't on his side. Outside the hotel entrance, several luxury vehicles pulled into the circular driveway. Valets hurried into position. Employees straightened their uniforms. Claire glanced through the glass doors. A familiar license plate slowly came into view. Her heart skipped. He's here. Every department manager instinctively stood straighter. Bradley emerged from his office, forcing confidence back onto his face. "Everyone!" He adjusted his tie. "Smile." The black executive sedan came to a gentle stop beneath the entrance canopy. The chauffeur stepped out first. Then he opened the rear passenger door. Charles Harrington calmly placed one polished shoe onto the pavement before rising from the vehicle. He thanked the chauffeur with a nod. Then, instead of walking toward the lobby, his eyes drifted across the rain-soaked street, toward the nearly empty bus shelter, toward a lone elderly black man sitting quietly with a faded backpack resting beside him. Charles froze. His breathing slowed. The silver pocket watch caught a brief reflection from the streetlights. Recognition flashed across his face. 30 years vanished in an instant. Without saying a single word to anyone waiting inside the hotel, Charles Harrington stepped away from the red carpet and began walking directly toward Malcolm Hayes. Every employee standing inside the Grand Meridian expected Charles Harrington to walk through the revolving doors. Instead, the billionaire hotel owner ignored the red carpet, ignored the executives waiting to greet him, and crossed the rain-soaked street toward the lonely bus shelter. Claire Bennett noticed first. "Mr. Harrington?" Her whisper spread through the lobby. Bradley Whitmore frowned. "What is he doing?" No one answered. Everyone simply watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Across the street, Malcolm Hayes remained seated on the cold metal bench. He seemed completely unaware that the owner of the hotel was approaching him. Charles stopped several feet away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Charles noticed the soaked coat, the trembling hands, and finally the silver pocket watch resting quietly in Malcolm's palm. His eyes widened. Before he could say a word, Bradley hurried out of the hotel, forcing a confident smile onto his face. "Mr. Harrington," Charles turned. Bradley reached them slightly out of breath. "I sincerely apologize for the disturbance outside the hotel. This gentleman wandered into the lobby earlier and frightened several guests. Security simply followed protocol." Malcolm slowly stood. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. Charles looked from Bradley to Malcolm, saying nothing. Mistaking the silence for agreement, Bradley continued. We have surveillance footage proving he refused to leave. Claire had followed them outside, despite knowing she could lose her job. That's not true. Bradley spun around. I told you to stay inside. Claire ignored him. Mr. Harrington. Mr. Hayes asked only to wait until the rain stopped. He never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone. Bradley laughed sarcastically. She's emotional. She broke protocol by trying to serve him food and hotel supplies. Charles remained expressionless. So both of you are saying very different things, Bradley answered immediately. The cameras will support everything I said. Claire looked directly at Bradley. Will they? For the first time, Bradley hesitated. Only for a second. Then he forced another smile. Of course. Marcus Ellison stepped out of the crowd holding his phone. I'm afraid they may tell a different story. Every head turned toward the investigative journalist. Bradley's stomach tightened. Mr. Ellison, I wasn't aware you were still here. I decided to stay. Marcus held up his phone. I recorded nearly the entire incident. Bradley's face froze. There must be some misunderstanding. Marcus calmly pressed play. The sound of Bradley's own voice echoed through the rainy evening. This hotel is for people who matter. A second later, you're trash. You don't belong anywhere near my guests. No one spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. Charles slowly lifted his eyes toward Bradley. Did you say those words? Bradley immediately shook his head. The recording is incomplete. It's been edited. Marcus didn't even blink. The original file has a verified timestamp. Bradley felt sweat forming despite the cold rain. He quickly changed tactics. This man has manipulated everyone. We don't even know who he is. Charles looked quietly at Malcolm. Sir. What is your name? Which Malcolm answered with the same calm dignity he had shown all evening. Malcolm Hayes. Charles repeated the name softly, almost to himself. Malcolm Hayes. Bradley immediately interrupted. He could be lying. Without warning, Ethan Pierce stepped forward from behind the security team. I searched his backpack. Malcolm looked at him but remained silent. There was no identification, Ethan continued. Only old papers, broken photographs, and that watch. Bradley seized the opportunity. You see, we have no proof this man is even telling the truth. Just then, another voice broke through the gathering crowd. We actually do. Everyone turned. Linda Foster walked out of the hotel carrying a large archival folder protected inside a waterproof case. Beside her was Claire. Bradley's expression changed instantly. What are you doing? Linda ignored him. She carefully removed the framed photograph she had found in the archives. Charles accepted it without saying a word. His eyes slowly traveled across the faded image. Edward Harrington stood proudly in the center. Beside him, a much younger Malcolm Hayes smiled modestly beneath a construction helmet. Charles gently brushed his fingers across his late father's face, then across Malcolm's. His breathing grew noticeably heavier. Bradley forced an uneasy laugh. Old photographs don't prove much, Linda calmly answered. There's more. She handed Charles another document. It was an original guest registry from the hotel's opening celebration, near the bottom of the page. Edward Harrington had written a handwritten note beside one name. Reserved at my personal request. The name beneath it read, Malcolm Hayes. Charles stared silently at the handwriting. He recognized it immediately. It was his father's. Bradley suddenly stepped forward. This has to be some mistake. Charles looked up. A mistake. Bradley nodded quickly. Someone may have forged these records years ago. Marcus almost laughed. You're suggesting someone forged 30-year-old archive documents stored in your own hotel. Several executives standing behind Charles exchanged uneasy glances. Bradley's explanation sounded weaker by the second. Desperate, he reached for one final defense. Sir, the surveillance footage inside the hotel will clear everything up. Claire looked directly at Charles. It won't. Bradley snapped toward her. What does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, another voice came from behind the crowd. The lobby footage was ordered deleted. Everyone turned again. The young surveillance technician stepped forward, visibly nervous. His hands shook as he spoke. Mr. Whitmore instructed me to erase the recordings between 6:30 and 7 tonight. Bradley's face turned pale. I did no such thing. The technician swallowed hard. I refused because the files had already been backed up to the Harrington Central servers. A wave of whispers spread through the executives gathered near the entrance. Charles slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed his phone. A notification had arrived only moments earlier from the corporate security division. Central Archive backup completed. Grand Meridian lobby cameras successfully uploaded. He quietly looked at Bradley, then at Malcolm. Finally, back toward the glowing entrance of the hotel. To nobody. Charles said in a calm but unmistakably commanding voice, is leaving until I review every second of that footage. The rain finally stopped, but for Bradley Whitmore. The real storm had only just begun. The lobby of the Grand Meridian had never been so quiet. Rainwater still glistened on the marble entrance as Charles Harrington slowly walked back inside the hotel. He didn't invite Bradley Whitmore to follow. He didn't acknowledge the anxious executives waiting to greet him. He walked beside Malcolm Hayes. The elderly black man, whose soaked clothes had made him an outcast only minutes earlier, now entered through the revolving doors with the owner of the hotel at his side. Every employee watched in stunned silence. The same guests who had stepped away from Malcolm earlier now instinctively made room for him. Bradley followed several steps behind, desperately trying to regain control. Mr. Harrington, he said quickly. I strongly recommend we discuss this privately. We have investors waiting. Charles stopped walking. He turned just enough to face Bradley. No. His voice was calm. This discussion belongs exactly where everyone can hear it. Those few words drained the last bit of confidence from Bradley's face. Charles looked toward the reception desk. Close the lobby. Claire blinked. Sir, no additional guests enter until we're finished. Within seconds, security officers locked the revolving doors and politely redirected arriving visitors to a side entrance. The executives exchanged nervous glances. Whatever was about to happen was no longer an internal personnel issue. It had become something much larger. Charles walked toward the center of the lobby beneath the massive crystal chandelier. He turned toward Malcolm. Would you please stand beside me? Malcolm hesitated. I don't wish to cause more trouble. Charles looked directly into his eyes. You've already carried enough of that burden. Slowly, Malcolm stepped forward. Bradley could barely hide his frustration. Sir, with respect, this man has no connection to this hotel. Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Claire. The photograph. Claire carefully handed him the framed picture recovered from the archives. Charles raised it so everyone in the lobby could see. This hotel opened 30 years ago. He pointed toward the younger man standing beside Edward Harrington. Does anyone recognize him? Most people shook their heads. Bradley folded his arms. It could be anyone. Charles lowered the photograph. Then perhaps this will help. He opened the silver pocket watch Malcolm had carried all evening. Everyone leaned forward. Inside the cover was the engraved sentence, "Time never forgets those who choose courage." Beneath those words was another engraving, almost hidden by decades of wear. To Malcolm, my brother forever. Edward Harrington. An audible gasp spread through the lobby. Bradley's eyes widened. He had mocked that watch, kicked it across the marble floor, called it junk, without realizing whose gift it had been. Charles gently closed the watch. My father never called employees his brothers. Silence answered him. He reserved that word for exactly one man. Charles looked toward Malcolm again. I've spent half my life hoping I would meet you. Malcolm lowered his eyes. I never expected to come back. Charles smiled sadly. My father knew you would. Bradley interrupted almost desperately. Sir, even if they knew each other years ago, that doesn't justify disrupting hotel operations. Charles slowly turned. You still don't understand. He looked at the executives standing nearby. My father built this company on one principle. He paused. Character before profit. Then he looked back at Malcolm. When I was 12 years old, my father told me a story he never allowed anyone else to publish. Charles's voice softened. He said there was a night when everything he had worked for was about to disappear. The lobby grew even quieter. A fire broke out in one of our construction warehouses. He glanced at the photograph again. Steel beams collapsed. Flames blocked every exit. Bradley swallowed nervously. My father was trapped. Charles continued. Everyone outside believed he was already dead. Malcolm remained completely still. But one man ran into that burning building anyway. Charles looked directly at him. You. No one moved. No one even breathed. Charles continued. My father told me that man carried him through smoke so thick neither of them could see. He paused again, and when a burning beam fell, Charles's voice almost broke. That man pushed my father out of the way and took the impact himself. Claire slowly looked toward Malcolm's right shoulder. For the first time, she noticed the stiffness in the way he moved. The old man had never fully lifted that arm. Charles nodded. My father always blamed himself for that injury. Malcolm finally spoke. It was worth it. Charles smiled through eyes beginning to fill with emotion. My father disagreed. He reached into the leather folder Megan Shaw had brought from the car. Inside was a yellowed envelope sealed with Edward Harrington's personal wax emblem. Charles carefully unfolded the handwritten letter. This was to be opened only if Malcolm Hayes ever returned. Even Bradley stopped breathing. Charles read aloud. To my son, if you are reading this, then life has finally brought Malcolm back to our door. Several employees exchanged astonished glances. Before you greet investors, before you greet politicians, before you greet anyone else. Charles looked up from the page, then slowly folded the letter. He stepped directly in front of Malcolm. The entire lobby watched. Every employee, every executive, every guest. Charles straightened his jacket. His posture became perfectly formal. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he raised his right hand in a crisp, respectful salute. I welcome you home, Mr. Malcolm Hayes. No one spoke. The silence was overwhelming. Claire covered her mouth as tears rolled down her face. Marcus Ellison slowly lowered his camera. Even Derek Sloan instinctively stood straighter. Across the lobby, Bradley Whitmore stared in disbelief. Only minutes earlier, he had called Malcolm trash. Now the owner of one of America's most prestigious hotel chains was saluting him in front of everyone. And Bradley suddenly realized his career had just ended. No one in the Grand Meridian lobby dared to move. Charles Harrington slowly lowered his salute, but his eyes never left Malcolm Hayes. The silence carried more weight than any speech ever could. Bradley Whitmore looked around desperately, hoping someone would challenge the moment, or somehow explain it away. No one did. Charles carefully unfolded the yellowed letter again. My father asked me to read the rest of this only in Malcolm's presence. His voice echoed softly beneath the crystal chandeliers. If Malcolm ever returns to this hotel, remember that every brick standing around you exists because he chose my life over his own. Charles paused, fighting emotion. The newspapers called me a visionary entrepreneur. They never knew I almost died before this hotel was ever finished. Every executive listened without blinking. When everyone else ran from the fire, Malcolm ran into it. He carried me through collapsing beams, refused every reward I offered, and disappeared before I could repay him. Charles lowered the letter. My father searched for Malcolm for years. He looked gently toward the elderly man. But Malcolm never wanted recognition. Malcolm finally smiled. Your father already thanked me. Charles shook his head. No. He spent the rest of his life believing he never thanked you enough. The room grew quiet again. Marcus Ellison raised his camera once more, documenting every word. He realized this wasn't simply a news story anymore. It was history correcting itself. Charles slowly turned toward the executives gathered near the entrance. Many of you know my father's public story. They nodded. But very few know what happened after the warehouse fire. He carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. My father offered Malcolm a senior position within the company. Malcolm chuckled softly. I told him someone else deserved it more. Charles smiled. He actually argued with you for nearly 2 hours. A few employees laughed quietly through their tears. My father even tried to buy Malcolm a house. Malcolm looked toward the marble floor. I already had everything I needed back then. Claire couldn't help asking. What happened? The question lingered in the air. For the first time that evening, Malcolm's peaceful expression faded. My wife became sick. He swallowed slowly. Insurance wouldn't cover the treatment. The lobby fell silent again. My daughter, his voice nearly disappeared, was killed by a drunk driver 6 months later. Claire covered her mouth. Marcus lowered his camera. Even Bradley looked away. I stopped answering my phone. Malcolm continued quietly. I stopped opening my mail. Charles nodded sadly. My father hired private investigators. They never found you. I made sure they wouldn't. Malcolm smiled faintly. I wasn't ready to be found. Charles turned toward Megan Shaw. Megan. She immediately stepped forward carrying another leather folder. Charles removed a notarized document. This was prepared by my father 23 years ago. He handed copies to several board members who had just arrived after hearing about the disturbance. Eleanor Whitfield, chairwoman of Harrington Hospitality's board of directors, adjusted her glasses as she read. Her eyes widened. She looked up at Charles. It's authentic. Charles nodded. My father amended the company's founder's charter. Whispers spread across the room. Eleanor read aloud. Should Malcolm Hayes ever return to any Harrington property, he shall forever be received as an honorary founder and family guest. He shall never be denied entry charged for lodging or treated as anything less than my own brother. Every employee stood frozen. Bradley's breathing became shallow. He suddenly understood the true magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't merely insulted a homeless man. He had publicly humiliated someone protected by the founder's own written wishes. Charles slowly faced Bradley. Did you know our company's first core value? Bradley struggled to answer. Excellence. Charles calmly shook his head. No. He pointed toward a bronze plaque mounted beside the grand staircase. For 30 years it has been hanging there. Everyone instinctively turned. The plaque read, "Dignity before luxury, people before profit." Charles looked back at Bradley. You walked past those words every morning. Bradley lowered his head. You memorized operating procedures. Charles took one step closer. But you forgot the only principle that mattered. Bradley's confidence completely disappeared. I'm sorry. Charles's expression remained firm. Are you apologizing because you hurt Malcolm? He paused. Or because you now know who Malcolm is? Bradley couldn't answer. His silence became the answer. At that moment, the surveillance technician approached carrying a tablet. Mr. Harrington, the backup footage has finished downloading. Charles accepted it. Without skipping a second, he connected the tablet to the massive display screen normally used for investor presentations. The lobby lights dimmed. Video filled the screen. Everyone watched as Malcolm politely entered the hotel, his quiet request to wait out the storm. Claire offering kindness. Bradley's mocking smile. The deliberate kick that sent the silver pocket watch sliding across the marble. Then the words every person in the room had already heard. You're trash. No one looked at Bradley anymore. Instead, every eye turned toward Malcolm. He had never raised his voice, never argued, never insulted anyone in return. He had responded to cruelty with quiet dignity. When the video ended, silence filled the room once more. Eleanor Whitfield closed her folder. As chairwoman of the board, she looked directly at Bradley. I move for the immediate termination of Bradley Whitmore's employment for gross misconduct violation of the founder's charter, attempted destruction of company evidence and conduct, bringing irreversible harm to Harrington Hospitality. Robert Gaines raised his hand. I second the motion. Every board member voted, one after another. Approved. 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 The decision was unanimous. Charles looked at Bradley one final time. Your employment ends now. Two corporate security officers quietly stepped forward, not to arrest him, simply to escort him out of the building he had believed he controlled. As Bradley slowly removed his manager's identification badge, he glanced once more toward Malcolm. The elderly man didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply wished Bradley something Bradley had never offered him. I hope one day you learn to see people before appearances. Bradley lowered his eyes. For the first time in many years, he had nothing left to say. The silence that followed Bradley Whitmore's dismissal felt different from the silence before. Moments earlier, it had been filled with shock. Now it was filled with reflection. Corporate security quietly escorted Bradley toward the exit. The man who had spent years controlling every detail inside the Grand Meridian walked past the employees who once feared him. No one applauded. No one mocked him. Most simply watched in silence. As Bradley reached the revolving doors, he stopped for a brief moment and looked back at the lobby one final time. The bronze plaque beside the staircase caught his attention. Dignity before luxury. People before profit. He had walked past those words every morning for nearly 12 years. Tonight was the first time he truly read them. Without another word, he lowered his head and disappeared into the cold Chicago night. Inside the lobby, Charles Harrington turned toward everyone gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Business can wait. The investors exchanged surprised glances. Our founder believed a company that forgets its values has already failed no matter how much money it earns. Several executives nodded quietly. Charles then faced Malcolm. "I've waited most of my life to say something." His voice softened. "Thank you." Malcolm smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." Charles shook his head. "I owe you far more than you realize." He looked around the lobby. "If Malcolm hadn't saved my father 30 years ago," he paused, "this hotel would never have existed." Every employee stood straighter. Many struggled to hold back tears. Eleanor Whitfield stepped forward carrying another folder. "The board of directors has reached an additional unanimous decision." She smiled warmly at Malcolm. "To effective immediately, you are recognized as an honorary founder of Harrington Hospitality." A quiet murmur spread across the lobby. "You will receive lifetime accommodations at every Harrington property in the country." She handed Malcolm a small velvet box. Inside was a gold key card engraved with his name. "Malcolm Hayes, Honorary Founder." Charles added with a smile, "No reservations, no expiration, no charges. This will always be your home." Malcolm looked at the card for several seconds before quietly closing the box. "I never came here asking for any of this." "I know." Charles nodded. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Claire Bennett stood quietly near the reception desk, believing the evening had finally ended. Instead, Charles turned toward her. "Claire." She stepped forward nervously. "Yes, sir." "Shoo," when everyone else chose appearances. He smiled. "You chose compassion." Claire lowered her eyes. "I only did what I thought was right." Charles looked toward Eleanor. "I'd like that officially recognized." Eleanor smiled. "As of tonight, Claire Bennett is promoted to Guest Relations Manager." Claire blinked. "I'm what?" Several employees laughed warmly. Charles continued. "Our guests don't simply need efficient service. They need people who remember they're human." The lobby erupted into sincere applause. Claire wiped away tears she could no longer hide. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." Marcus Ellison quietly closed his notebook. Charles noticed him. "Mr. Ellison." The journalist stepped forward. "I assume tomorrow's headlines have changed." Marcus smiled. "They certainly have." "What will they say?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "Homeless veteran of kindness welcomed home after 30 years." Malcolm chuckled softly. "I was never a veteran." Marcus smiled back. "No. See, but you've spent a lifetime fighting for something just as important. Human dignity." Later that evening, the investment gala finally began. Hundreds of executives gathered inside the grand ballroom expecting discussions about expansion revenue and international partnerships. Instead, Charles walked onto the stage carrying the old silver pocket watch. He placed it gently on the podium. "This," he began, "is the most valuable object in this hotel." The audience looked puzzled. "It isn't valuable because it's made of silver. It's valuable because it reminds us that character builds legacies." He told Malcolm's story, not as a tale of charity, but as a lesson about gratitude. When he finished speaking, every person inside the ballroom stood. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. Malcolm quietly remained in the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention. That was exactly where he had always preferred to be. 1 week later, Harrington Hospitality announced nationwide reforms. Every employee, from executives to housekeeping staff, would complete mandatory training centered on dignity, respect, and unconscious bias. The company's new orientation program opened with only one sentence: "The way you treat the person who can do nothing for you reveals who you truly are." The lobby plaque remained where it had always been, but now every new employee stopped to read it. 3 months later, Marcus Ellison's article received national recognition. Claire had become one of the highest-rated managers in the company's history. Guest letters praised her kindness almost daily. The Grand Meridian established the Malcolm Hayes Hospitality Scholarship, providing education and career opportunities for students from disadvantaged communities who wished to work in the hospitality industry. At the scholarship's dedication ceremony, Malcolm stood quietly beside Charles. Reporters asked whether he finally felt justice had been served. Malcolm looked across the crowd before answering. Justice isn't when someone powerful apologizes. It's when the next person who walks through those doors is treated with dignity before anyone knows their story. Charles smiled. My father would have loved that answer. Malcolm glanced toward the hotel entrance. People from every background walked through the revolving doors together. No one looked twice at anyone else. No one judged a person by their clothes. For the first time in decades, the Grand Meridian truly reflected the values Edward Harrington had dreamed of, and Malcolm finally felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his family. He felt at home.
Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world overlooks. Never measure a person's worth by their appearance, because every stranger carries a story you cannot see. If Malcolm's journey touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us why dignity, kindness, and courage will always matter.